Hello, everyone. Welcome to the July 11th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I am the head of community development. We're going to be talking about risk and governance. And in this call today, we have a special presentation from Cyrus. He's continuing his presentation of the general model for us. I want to, sorry, I shouldn't skip people. Vishesh will be presenting his Vishesh analytics when he tells us about the state of the peg. And then Matthew Rabinowitz will be giving us his weekly recap, or the weekly narrative towards the end of the hour, possibly afterwards. I want to keep momentum up though, so let's scramble through the preamble here. So if you have something to say, please say it. Don't be shy. If you have a microphone, let's leverage that capacity. If you don't have a microphone, please type your questions in the chat, and either David and I will be monitoring that, and we'll ask the questions for you when we get a chance. Or you can just store them up in there, and then after the hour, we've been hanging around for another 30 minutes to just do a general Q&A. Everyone's more than welcome to hang around for that. I think that's going to be it for the preambles right now. I'm going to jump into what I want to talk about and hopefully not burn up too much time. We have a new forum, and that forum was long overdue. There's all kinds of reasons why we waited a bit. I think that worked out well. There was a critical mass of content that was ready to go, and so we have people jumping into the forum, and I could not be happier with how well it's turned out. The content in there is amazing. The way that people are coming together and figuring out what needs to be done and how we should be doing it is extremely impressive. So if anybody in this call hasn't checked it out yet, I highly recommend that you do. I'm typing in the URL that's basically discoverable forum at MakerDAO. Have a look and contribute wherever you can. What I want to talk about today, though, is emergent processes and workflows and communities. And those are three different things. When you combine them, they get even more complicated. And one of the things that I want us as a group to begin to think about is, how do we surface valuable information? How do we collect that information? Where does that information live? And how do we all work together? These are all super hard questions. To give you some context, though, we've been solving them slowly over time and introducing them sort of one by one, and now it's time to start putting those pieces together. The pieces that we have are these calls. We have, let's break them down as we go. So we have these calls. These calls are a very small time window. They're all held in English. They're in North American friendly time zones. I repeat these caveats every single time. And that's why we don't make decisions in these calls. We don't set governance. This isn't where governance happens, or governance decisions happen. This is where governance debates and education and community building and sort of this social consensus occurs, where we all kind of figure out whether we're on the same page or not. That's great, and it's required, and it's super valuable, and so valuable that in the near future, I hope we're going to be expanding these calls to, let's do one for the APAC region. Let's have another one that's going weekly for the Latin American region. We need more than just one call, and we need to expand these things because they are so valuable. But there's all kinds of downsides too. So that there's no opportunity for deep debate or deep discussion. We're not going to start pulling apart algorithms in these calls. We can't give everyone an opportunity to have a back and forth because there's just not enough time. They're very temporal, so they last for an hour or an hour and a half. If you miss that, you're out of luck. You have to watch it on YouTube. So it has its pros, it has its cons. And the pros and cons for each one of these things I'm going to list are basically the same. There's immediacy, there's sort of this dynamic interaction aspect, and those are always traded off against their time to live, basically. So calls last for an hour, they last for a week, or potentially, I guess they could last forever if somebody wants to go back into the archives and watch 49 straight hours of community calls. They're more than welcome to do it. That's unlikely to happen. So in order to allow us as a group to design workflows and have debates and figure out what our process is, we have these other forums, and these other venues are designed to allow for less immediacy, more long tail utility and discoverability and auditability. And those other locations are the chats. The chats are all, actually, I think that we probably have the best chat in crypto, and I'm going to go on record as saying that. The chat is amazing, but it's also very temporal. So we have these calls that last an hour for every week. We have these really, really cool chats in Rocket that last 20 minutes, an hour at a time, and then they kind of cycle out of visibility after 24 hours or so. So that gets, it's good for rapid fire debates, getting to the heart of an issue, and then coming up with an answer to something, and then having that answer slowly disappear through the history as you scroll up. So to solve that problem, we have a forum. And this forum, like I said earlier, is turning out swimmingly. So in this forum, we have deeper debates. These debates they could last forever if you're familiar with the way the debates happen in ETH Research and some other venues, that they could potentially happen for months and months at a time and then go quiet and then resurface. And that's what we need, because there's a lot of complicated things happening at MakerDAO. What we're doing is actually serious business. There's lots of super smart people that need to be heard. And that needs to happen in a venue that there's no fear that like chats or these calls or Reddit, which cycles out after 24 hours or 7 days. We have this location where we can all get together, have our say, compose some well thought out arguments, and then get feedback from everybody else in the community. It's amazing, but it's also temporal, and it's also a bit messy. And we need to be concerned about getting to the situation where we start devising canonical documents in the forum. We don't want to be in a position where 6 months down the line, people are constantly referencing this epic thread, and that's where we expect the world to go to discover what it is that happened at MakerDAO at that point. The forum should be there to arrive at a decision, to formulate a document, to discover a process. And once that happens, that information needs to move out of the forum, and it needs to go somewhere even more canonical than the forum. And what we do, and what we have been doing for the last year or so with MakerDAO, the community group, which has been working out very well, is we have a workflow. And that workflow is we iterate with community members on specific projects or ideas. We generally end up in a HackMD where engaged stakeholders are working together to iterate on a doc. We discuss those changes in various venues like chat or the forum. And once a final draft has been achieved, and if this doc has utility to the wider ecosystem, is probably going to last, what happens is that document gets taken out of HackMD or copied out of a forum or out of a chat or out of a Reddit post, and it goes into GitHub, because that's the world that we live in. We might be writing documentation, but it has all kinds of pros for us as a community. It's a flat file content database. It's easily distributed to multiple people, or X number of people. It is versionable. It has a public audit trail. There's lots and lots and lots of reasons why GitHub is a great place to put a document once that document is finished. And so we, in the community group, we put those documents into GitHub, and then after that, another reason why GitHub is so great is that it's easy to ingest content there to anything you could possibly imagine. So once that content is in GitHub, it could get pulled into the CDP portal or the voting portal, or it can get pulled into various other flat file marketing, our primary websites, or even to third-party websites are welcome to start ingesting that content as they please. And that's it's a discussion that I want to start having with the community here, as well as we start digging into governance and risk more deeply now that we have this forum. I'll be making a post about this, recapping some of these thoughts, and then putting out some suggestions about what these emergent workflows could look like. So discussion starts in Rocket. It'd be nice if we got into the habit of saying, like, hey, this is a great discussion. Can somebody just recap this for the forums, and then let's take it into the forums. And if it turns into something, perhaps we can say, all right, well, let's throw this into a HackMD, and let's find people that want to own this process or this idea. And then we can iterate on that. And once it's done, it goes into GitHub, and then it becomes canonical, or it becomes official. ish in air quotes, and then from there we can display it wherever we like. And if it comes time to review or revise, we have a very clear path that's well understood. You submit an issue in GitHub, and then you submit a PR, and then now we have a new doc. It's a technical business we're in, full of technologists. I don't think it's going to be too freaky to expect that kind of behavior, but I would like to explore it. And that is my speechifying for the week. So there'll be a forum thread soon that encapsulates some of these ideas. That's basically looking for feedback from the community about how are we going to capture this cool work that's happening? How do we sort of formalize it a bit, and how do we make sure that it doesn't get lost? Okay, I'm going to stop it there.
I have a quick question for you.
Right.
So the information that you see coming out of the forum into GitHub is stuff that is important to decision making for maker holders. So like am I understanding correctly that the types of docs would be like collateral onboarding applications, due diligence stuff, things of that nature, or are you also thinking about like interesting threads, important conversations, important debates?
Well, yeah, and this is why I'm going to make a forum thread so we can all hash this out together. So the initial, my initial thoughts are, and I don't want to embarrass people and or pick favorites, but I'll do it anyway. So Long for Wisdom is doing a lot of really cool stuff in the forums, and one of the reasons why I wanted this forum to be out there is because of this continuing heartbreak that I've been experiencing with Reddit over the last year or two, where somebody would sit down, put a great deal of time and effort and thought into a forum post, and it would be completely ignored. And the reason it gets completely ignored is because people go to Reddit for to get themselves raged up and or to just figure out what's going on. And as soon as they see a wall of text, they don't even engage at all. There's not even enough will to like complain about things. And I wanted to get around that process. So in the forums, we've already seen deep engagement, but the second part of that heartbreak was having the stuff age out and not actually go anywhere. And I think that making sure that it ends up in a place that's discoverable, centrally understood, like this is the repo where things go to, and this is how we update those things, goes a long way to making or converting some of these documents into canonical things. But there's also going to be a few different buckets. Like, is this going to be like an idea for improvement to the system? Is this an idea for some kind of public resource for how to engage with governance? Is this going to be like tools and tips for collateral invest super sleuths or whatever they're called then? So I don't know. We need to figure out some buckets, and where these things live and whether they actually become official, we need to figure out. But I want to make sure that we start collecting the stuff and it doesn't get lost, because there's just too much good work happening. Okay, I am going to stop talking now. Cyrus, I'm going to hand it off to you for risk.
Okay, cool. We good on screen?
We good?
Okay. Okay, so just a reminder where we are in the process. The collateral onboarding guide did come out this week, but I don't want to break the flow of what we're talking about right now, so I'll probably come back to that in, I think, 1 or maybe 2 weeks. Today we're going to mainly finish up and recap the stability fee model. And yeah. And then first, I want to talk a little bit about the discussion at the end of last week that Matthew brought up regarding the DSR and risk premium rate. I want to clarify a couple things and open up for discussion. Essentially, the way I'm thinking about it and I think others are as well, is that we know that borrowers pay stability fee, which is comprised of a few different costs that are associated with the loan. One of those is this fee associated with expanding the DAI supply, and is essentially a value transfer from borrowers to the counterparties who end up holding the DAI, right? So let's say someone goes out and borrows 100 million DAI, and then they want to just flood the market with it. There needs to be some sort of a compensation to the counterparty to incentivize them to hold on to that DAI. Now, as we all know, and we've discussed before, single collateral DAI did not implement this optimally. The DSR isn't actually live, and so this value transfer doesn't work as we would like it to, and this has led to potentially a higher than normal stability fee. Now, in addition to this fee associated with helping keep DAI stable, there's also this element of credit risk associated with the CDP, and this is a risk compensation also paid by the borrower, but to the MKR token holders. And we call this the risk premium, or the risk premium rate. And the collateral risk models, which we've been discussing the last couple of weeks and the next couple of weeks, are all designed to cover this latter risk premium, not so much the DSR. And so very simply, we can think of the total stability fee as being the sum of this monetary supply expansion and this credit risk. And then there are a few others as well, such as risk team compensation and some others, but that's not important for right now. And so right now, the stability fee being 18.5%, we should be asking, is that due to the expansion of the DAI supply or because of the risk premium associated with Ether? Well, I think it's pretty clear that it was actually due to the supply expansion, right? As a community, we've never really even talked about the potential collateral risk of ETH. DAI launched with 0.5% stability fee, and we only started raising the stability fee as the DAI supply grew and the DAI peg started to weaken. And right, so as we approach MCD launch, we got to start thinking about how that DSR portion of the stability fee will evolve once the DSR is actually functioning, and how we're going to handle the risk premium rate. And so this is kind of what I imagine the setup to look like right now, where we have the bulk of the stability fee being paid for by the monetary expansion and pretty much nothing to the risk premium rate. And after MCD launch, once the DSR is live, that the supply rate will almost certainly drop considerably, but then we will have to add back what is the proper reflection of credit risk for the CDP due to the collateral backing it. And it's also kind of interesting to note that this right-hand side was never really discussed by anyone over the months, given that the media was always harping on the increasing rates, but technically speaking, there was also somewhat of an offset with the lack of any risk premium being assessed. And it also kind of highlights that in the end, borrowers and really everybody just cares about this total stability fee. And sometimes breaking it down into the individual components can maybe potentially complicate the analysis a little bit. And this is even more true when we start talking about how different collateral types impacting the DSR might negatively impact, well, let me just get to the next slide. But basically what Matthew was talking about last week as a result of the conversation is that if the risk premiums are not properly set, then potentially certain collateral types impacting the DSR might unfairly impact other collaterals and in essence might end up pricing them out. So let's say the DSR needs to be raised and it prices a certain collateral asset out of the portfolio. Is this something that we care about? Is this something that we should actively stop from happening? My view is that this is not really a risk decision at that point, but more of a business decision by the MKR community on how they want to proceed. So for example, you could raise the DSR, but then adjust a certain collateral type's risk premium back downwards to offset it and help keep it safe. Yeah, does anybody have any thoughts or questions on this? I know there was just a tiny bit of confusion last week.
Yeah, I do, Cyrus. So when we think about the risk premium rate, that's going to apply to each collateral type, correct?
Right.
And then the DSR is obviously going to apply across all of those collateral types. So it's this one larger figure that's going to move to hopefully help us expand and contract supply.
Right.
And so then every CDP holder will have a stability fee based on their collateral and that DSR percentage rate.
Right.
Okay, that's it.
Right. So, yeah, I think hopefully that clarifies it. Matthew, do you have any comments on this?
No, it's really to just comment back, and Vishesh, I think you're on the line, but it's to kind of compliment him on his comment probably 2 or 3 weeks ago when he said basically if we just set the risk premium rates correctly, that really should adjust it. And so in my mind's eye, the risk premiums are just purely conditions based on a given collateral, whatever the risk associated to that collateral would be, and trying to segregate risk policy and monetary policy.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's fairly intuitive to segregate the monetary policy and risk policy from a risk perspective. But then if the community wants to go back and manually override certain parameters for the benefit of a collateral type, then that's perfectly doable, possible, maybe even recommended in some cases. But just want to highlight that
we should try to avoid it, because at the end of the day, that can also turn into an attack vector, which is Vishesh's point. What he mentioned was if we just set them correctly in the first place, and that may mean that the DSR should be elevated and some of the risk premiums actually should be significantly increased, even if it's not politically appetizing. If there's more associated risk, then that's the consequence of risk, is a risk premium increase.
Right.
Yeah, just this is, I think, the place, like this subject area, the reason that like I think you and Matthew are both kind of getting involved on the same issue is because this is kind of that intersection between sort of the risk premiums, the risk modeling, and the monetary policy going forward in MCD. Because yeah, Matthew's right. I said that, in the event that we set the risk premiums properly, you wouldn't have this sort of discriminatory effect. But if they are improperly set, there needs to be a plan in place for how could you correct them. And I think the number one way that they would get improperly set, other than just, people not doing their jobs correctly and, anybody doing the math, et cetera, misses something, that can happen. But also, a lot of that risk modeling is going to be based on certain behavioral patterns, historical data, assumptions. If the state the system changes significantly mid-flight, you need to be able to have a lever to make adjustments. And I think that would be the case, is like if you model risk under certain assumptions and those assumptions change, you need a, you know, path to correcting that. And the DSR won't be that path, was kind of my point, because the DSR is a broad tool. Right. So we're going to need to develop tools to evaluate or analyze when things are out of line. And for example, hopefully we can converge somewhat quickly on what the correct DSR level should be, so that if we see large deviations in the DSR, then we can try to figure out if something is wrong on the other side of the equation. Yeah, and I think as we go forward, it's going to be really easy to tell if something is wrong. I think it's going to become really hard to tell which thing that is wrong is causing the overall outcome, in terms of like multiple different assets and attributing different behaviors to, you know, the CDPs from a given asset. I think that's going to become a really tricky problem. Yeah. It's also going to be really difficult if a bunch of new collateral types start flooding in at once, right? If, say, every cycle something like 10 collateral types are added, and then the peg adjusts poorly, then it's going to be tough to figure out what was the root cause of that.
Some of that also will be just a progression where you start off with a given quote unquote collateral package, and you intentionally have a stability fee that is ridiculously conservatively high, with the full intent over the period of, say, 6 months to release an identical collateral package with a lower stability fee and drop the debt ceiling on A in favor of B, and slowly roll out. I guess what I'm saying is to slowly introduce a very conservative approach, which is very de-risked and naturally progress downward.
Right. Yeah, I want to echo that. I think like design principles are going to become really important to hammer down here. And like we talk about scientific governance. Well, a big part of scientific governance is like experimentation and controlling for variables. And like we saw this with the stability fee. If you change too much too quickly, you don't know what the effect was. So one is, I think you don't want to add 10 things at once. You know, that scenario you described, I would, you know, recommend finding a way to phase things out as much as possible. And then I agree with Matthew as well, like starting off safer and then easing the dial as you go is also going to help control for potential issues that you run into. Yeah, I imagine this will be one of the first major things we would work on after MCD launch, at least as part of risk and research.
I mean, realistically, you're not gonna rip the Band-Aid off until, like, for big time new collateral coming in after maybe a couple other collateral types on Ethereum. But like when security tokens, when that happens, that's when we'll have a flood of collateral to come in, when the SEC starts allowing that to come happen. So. Right.
Yeah, the danger with just letting it, starting really high and easing it over time and setting that as a rule that you're going to do that, is you observe the collateral's behavior over a time interval that you don't have a choice over. In other words, it could be that you're observing it over a period that is under a collateral price regime that is favorable to the asset, and you believe that there is less credit risk there because you haven't seen a bad environment for it. And so, you know, you leave it open for a year and it's a good year. And over that year, you're declining it. Really, the next year is where the problems begin, which is why I think it also makes sense to think a little bit more first principle with some of these and saying, well, you know, how much do we want to ease the dial here? Because that's how you get situations where your own euphoria allows you to take more and more risk when in fact you should be doing the opposite. Just waiting things out over time doesn't always give you the right answer.
And I'm not sure if I'm agreeing or disagreeing with you here, Alex, but like a classic component of a lot of uncertainty mapping, like algorithms in AI, is you sort of up your confidence interval with more data that you've seen. And so initially, you should actually have a very low confidence for most assets. Like ETH might be a slight exception, but for most assets, you should have a very low confidence, gain dial, and then increase that. I think as you start to see more behavior, more data that you can actually draw inferences from.
Yeah, I don't know if you're agreeing or disagreeing with me either, but that sounds correct to me.
Okay, cool. Let's move on. So back to the credit model, which is designed to find out what that correct risk premium rate should be. Okay, so last week we went through a very simple model on how to calculate expected loss for CDP, made a few assumptions, introduced an options analogy towards the end. I think a lot of it was a bit confusing, so I'm going to try to give it another shot and do a review of it and hopefully be more clear today. In general, it's not particularly easy covering the full scope of these models in 30-minute increments. So please get involved on the Rocket Chat and on the forum if you want to dive into these a little bit deeper. Okay, so we know that this premium rate has something to do with the credit risk of the CDP. And the credit risk, and by credit risk, I mean the potential for losses and uncertainties for MKR holders. And so we're uniquely concerned with what these losses look like, how they occur, why they occur, how badly they are. Simple way to think about losses for CDPs is that they occur when collateral prices gap down suddenly, or when the auctions don't clear due to liquidity and slippage concerns. So if you think about it, if you were to completely remove black swans and huge gaps down and have and be able to liquidate infinite collateral at spot price, you'd never have any loss in a CDP, no matter what. And so our goal in trying to describe these losses is that we want to convert this notion of loss into the stability fee, or the risk premium rate. And so there's a very general model of how to do this, which involves looking at the likelihood of default, as well as the severity of the losses, or the loss given default. But these general models are sometimes just kind of intuition driven. And when you actually kind of dive deep to do the actual analysis, you'll see that it's highly dependent on the type of loan it is. So for example, calculating loss metrics for an ETH-backed CDP is much different than if you were trying to figure out your risk on a credit card loan. So, and the reason being should also be somewhat intuitive, in the sense that for credit cards, you could probably look back at, 100 years or whatever of credit card data and estimate what these frequencies should be, because they probably don't change dramatically over time. But with Ether, we don't have a lot of historical data. We don't have great intuition in how it evolves. And we can identify a handful of latent risk factors that could cause some pretty catastrophic price movements, things that haven't actually ever occurred, but we can imagine they occur. And so as we go from this general risk model, we have to apply our own understanding of Ether to make the model be realistic. And so this is how we've more or less arrived at how to do the Ether-backed credit risk model. So first step is you collect your inputs, which is your due diligence report, your risk rating, the onboarding application, you have your trading history, you have historical CDP stats, and you have the current CDP distribution. We define our loss event as when the collateralization ratio breaches the liquidation ratio. And our next step is to identify what can cause this collateralization ratio to go up or down. And collateralization ratios essentially change based on the underlying asset price as well as user behavior. And so when we dive into these risk factors, we want to know, what does ETH do? How does it move? And for behavior, what do users do in response to, for one, ETH price drops. So when it rallies or falls, and locking and unlocking collateral, but potentially user behavior can be impacted by other factors as well. And our risk rating, which is one of our inputs, so we're looking for fundamental information that can impact asset prices. And I mean, typically things that aren't immediately clear just by looking at the price chart. And that can be just a simple classification is, you can have fundamental risks, protocol risks, exchange risks, and regulatory. And obviously these are pretty important to understand as we create CDPs. And so we want to be able to convert these risks into a risk rating, which will then somehow make its way into the actual calculations. And so once you've defined and analyzed your risk factors, you essentially want to simulate them to see how they intermix with each other and how they evolve over time. And so what we're doing is we start with the current CDP distribution, and at every time increment forward, we apply a function that is a change in the asset price, and we model this using a stochastic asset pricing model, which we discussed a little bit last week. And in here, we include factors such as the volatility, and we are tracking, we're tracking the risk rating as well, and how it affects and how it impacts any sorts of jump risks. Obviously, we know that that liquidations can occur slowly or can gap downwards. We also apply a behavioral function that increases or decreases the amount of DAI drawn or the amount of ETH locked up. And this is a whole aspect of research in itself. And then we also apply a slippage function to deal with liquidation. Essentially, you run the simulation a whole bunch of times, and for each one of those paths, you essentially track how much collateral was liquidated, and you record how much loss was incurred, right? So let's say you do this thousands of times. And you end up with a distribution of losses. And some of these paths, nothing happens, right? ETH price just goes up, no liquidations, fine. Some of these paths, you'll have liquidations, but, well, some you'll have liquidations, but the collateral is fine. Some you'll have liquidations, but the collateral is not fine because of liquidity. And then sometimes you'll just see the asset just completely collapse downwards, right? And so with this simulation, we've more or less achieved what we were trying to get at, which is a pseudo potential distribution of losses. And we can a simple characterization of this distribution is the expected loss, or the average of those losses. So this is kind of what the visual, this is like a visual representation of that simulation, right? So you have some paths that are fine and plenty that breach the collateralization ratio threshold. And for those, you want to apply a slippage analysis, yada, yada. And so now we can have a handle on, for a particular CDP or group of CDPs, what can we expect to lose for MKR holders? How much bad debt is expected to be triggered? And of course, MKR holders are not bearing this risk for nothing. So there needs to be some sort of risk compensation for this. And of course, that is what the risk premium rate is in the first place. And so you convert that expected loss into this credit spread, which is actually a quite simple calculation at this point, once you've done the simulations. We talked a little bit about this last week as well. Right, and then so back to what I was talking about last week with the whole options analogy. And essentially, if you were to simplify that simulation with a bunch of assumptions, such as no behavioral changes, no jump risk, and a few others, your loss distribution is equivalent to that of a put option on the underlying collateral, Ether. And intuitively, this should make sense that MKR holders, they are behaviorally short a put, right? When the Ether price collapses, their losses increase the further the price goes down, but they receive stability fees as compensation for that. And so in this simplified example, you could actually just apply the Black-Scholes formula, but of course we can't exactly do that analytically because we do have to factor in behavior and jump risk and a whole bunch of other stuff. And so another way to describe this example is if you had a CDP with 100 die debt and a $200 liquidation price, and then you constructed a put option with the same parameters, then the CDP would be completely riskless, right? There'd be no way for the CDP to lose money because as Ether price dips below 200, the put option will perfectly offset any losses. And so you can kind of glean that a CDP that hypothetically has this put option embedded into it, which of course there isn't, but if it was, then the CDP shouldn't actually command any sort of risk premium because there is no risk to it. And so now that we've removed this hypothetical put, then you can reason about what that risk premium should be. And it's dependent on what the price of this put is. And the insight, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Just so I understand something, so the put doesn't purely and completely offset one-to-one with the CDP unless there's an additional assumption about how people are managing their debt, if
right.
correctly, right? So in other words, put will always be, so that the value on the other side for the seller is always, of the buyer is always greater than or equal to the value of the put, right? Because to the seller, third correction, the seller can get back at least that value, or they could get more if they can exercise and keep the difference, right? Insofar as you believe that like the CDP owner has properly rebalanced. So not only does the default not happen, i.e. the loss didn't materialize, you also now have the put option. So it's not a pure equality, it's a greater than or equal to relationship. Right, that's assuming the MKR hold. So implicitly, if the MKR holder is selling a put, implicitly you're saying the CDP owner is buying that put, right? Somebody has to buy it if you're selling it.
Right.
And
I'm not sure I understood your question though, but.
Right, so you're assuming here that there's no, there's no rebalancing happening, right? I don't recapitalize my CDP. And so the equality holds strictly, but in reality, people do manage their debt sometimes well or sometimes poorly. But right, because option is just basically the worst case scenario if they manage it quite poorly. Like it perfectly offsets.
Right. So the behavior can add to the risk as well, right? So I think
oh yeah, that's right.
Vishesh was I think if I'm understanding your point correctly, I think me and Vishesh spoke about this recently, where if the ether price were to rally a bunch, and then a user would withdraw a whole bunch of collateral, then they have added risk to their CDP, right?
Right. You're right. And so so the assumption here is a little bit weaker. Then it's like it's not just that there's no recapitalization happening at all, is that the recapitalization that's positive and that's negative to the system, like
yeah, you'd have to like dynamically manage your put options, right? You'd always have to be going in and out of different strikes and different notional amounts.
Yeah, so you're dynamically replicating as a
right.
That makes sense. Thank you. Vishesh, were you about to say something? Sorry.
No, I mean, I was roughly going to say the same thing. It's similar to like, if you have many different CDPs, because it's not just one CDP, right? It's really a pool of CDPs that are entering and exiting all these different states. And so, basically the idea is net equilibrium. If ETH price goes up in the short term, collateralization does tend to increase, but then it does balance out a bit. And then similarly, when ETH price depreciates, people do recollateralize. And so these things, like the hypothesis or the theory is that they roughly balance out to some sort of steady state.
Got it. Okay, so that makes perfect sense. Thank you.
And okay, cool. So, and one of the interesting insights from looking at this from an options perspective is that aspects that are important to options pricing are also relevant to us, and in particular, the volatility. And so when we talk about the volatility of the CDP, and in particular the default risk and all that, we're pretty interested in the tails, right? And tail risk is obviously one of the most important aspects of risk management for Maker. And while there's no simple way to reason about the tails for a bunch of reasons that I've mentioned before, we are looking at three components of the volatility here. One being standard market volatility, standard deviation returns, another being the liquidity analysis for auctions, and then finally, probably the most important one being these fundamental risk factors that cause these sudden gaps downward. And so some of the research we've been doing here is we've been going back and collecting data on all of the major losses and drawdowns of the Ether price over the past couple of years, and kind of classifying them by what caused them and a whole bunch of different metrics. And this is where we've kind of gleaned that the main source of drawdowns are typically protocol related, exchange related, and regulatory related. And using these metrics, you can have an approximation of one, how frequent these big drawdowns are, and two, the severity of these losses. And in that way, we can input these metrics into our simulation to help create more realistic tails for the losses. And I would say that this is kind of just the beginning of this research. There's a lot of different ways to go from here in terms of collecting information. So for example, redoing this analysis, but for Bitcoin, and then, you know, making an assumption that the frequency and severity of ETH drawdowns is somewhat correlated to Bitcoins as well. And by doing so, you can maybe get more data into your model. But essentially, the goal here is, essentially, I mean, the ultimate goal is we want to know how bad these losses can get, right? And so our estimation for losses from our simulation has to factor in somehow that these events do occur, not frequently, but they do occur, and they can be damaging. This may seem like a fairly imprecise manner of doing so, but again, this is ongoing research, and I think we can all, I mean, it's just an approximation that will have to suffice for now. And so, yeah, I mean, going into some questions of complexity and further research about this entire model. Yeah, I mean, as it's listed on the slide, this is work that will be iterated on, hopefully for potentially years and years to come, right? As we sharpen up our data and our models. For now, though, as we get nearer to MCD launch, just having kind of a rough idea of, you know, a rough awareness that these types of big drawdowns occur, particular so that we don't underprice our tails, which is a particular concern with standard asset pricing models. But I would say that this is the fun part of risk work. It's the interesting part of risk work for sure. So yeah, again, pop into the forums if you want to discuss more about this stuff. And there's actually a lot of other aspects of the model as well. So far we've just kind of hit on the high points, but you know, we can do more analysis into, that's a typo. That should say liquidation penalties, not ratios. So, oh no, sorry. That's at the bottom. Yeah, higher liquidation ratios do result in different amounts of expected losses. So for example, if you have your liquidation ratio at 200%, then losses would be significantly lower, and stability fees would also be lower. We'll talk about this next time with liquidity analysis.
One quick question. This is for when we're basically creating and needing to determine a risk premium completely, you know, vanilla, when we don't have any background behind it. How would we compare, like, I think we've mentioned this once, it's like a credit default swap for, you know, a bond for a given company, doesn't matter, that's got a credit rating and a CDS that's a known CDS. How much of our risk work would we, I wouldn't use the word outsource, but, you know, get guidance from, inspiration from, to get some of those metrics?
A lot, as much as possible in terms of guidance and outsources, of course. I mean, I don't see why we wouldn't borrow as much efficient public market information as possible. I mean, in fact, the only reason we couldn't do that right now is because I don't trust the Deribit ETH options market for anything, and certainly no CDS market on CDPs. So that public market information just isn't available for our particular choice of collateral backing right now.
No, correct. More commenting, like, just, if we took JP Morgan debt and somehow whatever legal construct would allow us to use it as collateral, and then we were to decide what should be the stability fee for that, where it's an investment grade cash flowing asset, and there's a known CDS for that security, right? How much of that would that, I wouldn't say directly, we wouldn't want to just cut and paste it, but we should be able to take a good 95% of the work has already been done on a debt security.
Sure. Yeah. I don't know. I guess we'll see when we get there. Okay. I definitely agree with the sentiment. Right. As Rich mentioned earlier, a user by the name of Long for Wisdom has started a community due diligence initiative right now, going through the collateral onboarding guide and collecting information. Over the next few weeks, we will start releasing further frameworks for qualitative due diligence and basically getting ready for collateral evaluations. Should be interesting stuff. And that is it. Any questions about anything? Hopefully that made things a little bit clearer from last week. All right, cool. If there's no questions, then Vishesh, I guess if you want to jump into the monetary policy stuff.
Sure. So a lot to cover, but I'll still try to do it pretty quickly. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen all right. Fun fact, we've crossed 360 million loans originated from Maker, so yay. All right, so the ETH price, I think we noticed that, for about a week there was going down a bit. That, was following a tail of a huge volume of ETH for DAI traded, and then, successively a fair amount of leveraging behavior with ETH price coming down. And I don't think there was a lot of contention around that explanation. It seemed to track with a lot of what we'd seen before. Obviously, things had been pretty stable around the 16.5% level because there had not been, as much leveraging all at once. So when the stability fee is a little bit lower and you have a lot of leveraging all at once, it, is pretty reasonable to expect that the DAI price would take a little bit of a hit. There was a fair amount of discussion around whether this should be resolved on its own or whether a stability fee increase was necessary. Seems, I was kind of ambivalent on that. It could have recovered on its own, I think, but the community, I think, chose to take a more cautious approach, I guess, and increase the stability fee to try and right the ship relatively manually. So that stability fee was increased to 17.5%. Things were pretty stable. That was increased to 18.5% again. So it'll be interesting to see if sometimes the stability fee increases are timed hilariously poorly with ETH price movements. So it's hard to tell which had an effect, but it will be interesting to get more data points to see if this actually pushes up the DAI price at all. Just to touch on what's been going on in the last 24 hours, pretty much same state as what had been shown in that graph, roughly hovering around the 0.98 level. Pretty solid spreads that we've seen recently, and I think pretty solid volume. So when you have kind of that increased amount of volume, you do tend to see a more smooth or less discrete spread. Continuous was the word I was looking for. So yeah, as I mentioned, the ETH price, for the majority of June had kind of been running up a bit, and then just around the tail end of June started to take a hit. Similarly, the DAI price did kind of a similar thing where it was holding pretty steady and then took kind of a hit. This is primarily leverage in this area. And then, as ETH price started to recover a little bit, DAI price started to recover a little bit, and then ETH, took another nosedive, and even the most recent nosedive is cut off.
Yeah, let's give them a second to return. I'll use the dead air while we're waiting. Matthew happily reminded us that there's been a discussion in the forums recently about the debt ceiling. We should talk about it today in this call because it's an interesting, probably the first example of a signal being raised in the forum that could potentially precede a poll in the governance system. And we're still trying to figure out what that mechanism looks like. Please visit the link that I posted in the sidebar or in the chat. Have a look at what's going on in there, and let's have a discussion about this. I'm assuming Vishesh will be
the
back
one
in
thing that's missing in that thread, Rich, is the option for no change, just like as a general. I think most people are in agreement that that ceiling should be raised, but I know somebody had brought it up there.
Yeah, and this ties back to my emergent behavior kind of meme that I've been pushing, is that we need to figure out what that actually looks like. So this is the first kick at the can, but I would like to have some kind of a standard. So here's, and actually I think that Long for Wisdom is already going down that road. That there needs to be some kind of a standard. So here's an official title, here's an official set of options, here's how we do public or non-public, here's how we make sure that there's a no change or a lack of confidence in the poll. There's things that we need to understand. And that's probably a good example of one of those sort of theoretical GitHub documents that I was talking about, because that would be a good example. So, an official doc about what does signal generation look like in the forums. And then people could just reference this GitHub page that says, make sure all the options are there, make sure that it's public or private or whatever the community decides. And then we'll know what to refer people to the next time they come up with a signal request.
So what is the next step with that? I mean, are we just going to debate it on the forum, and then we?
I mean, the debt ceiling specifically.
Yeah.
I don't know. This is where I wish I had more time in the day so I could have come back with a great plan for you guys, but I don't have one. So we need to figure this out. The forum is there in order to collect signals and to have great debates, and for us to figure out as a group what we should be doing. And it happened sooner than I expected. And so the first example of that is the debt ceiling thing. But how we move ahead with this thing, I'm still kind of in the dark about. We're hobbled right now with, so yeah, let me set some context here. And this should probably all be captured in the forum. So I'll promise to put these thoughts in there. But we're hobbled right now in that the governance is completely ruled by stability fees. Because we have severe limitations in the capacity of our voting mechanism. Those limitations I have been promised. Well, I haven't been promised, but I'm assuming it's a promise. That's what I heard. That there's going to be a new portal coming out very, very soon, potentially this month or early the first week of next, which will allow us to do a significant number of arbitrary polls. So the question in my mind is, do we put the stability fee, our ability to alter the stability fee on hold while we think about debt ceilings? So we need to figure out, I think, the severity of the requirements for this change. Like, do we need to fix the debt ceiling in the next 3 weeks, or is something bad going to happen? If we don't, then yeah, we can say, okay, we're going to put the stability fee on hold next week or the week after. But as I'm not shy to point out, I'm not smart enough to know. So I require the analysts and the monetary policy experts and the risk teams to sort of lead that discussion, I guess, or at least frame that discussion and interpret the value of the arguments that showed up in that forum thread, I think. If it turns out that it is critical, then yeah, we can say, all right, as a group, everybody needs to go to this thread. They need to vote in that poll. And depending on the results, next week or the week afterwards, we're going to replace the stability fee with a debt ceiling raise. I think that was an unsatisfying answer, but did that cover what you were asking, Matthew?
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I guess the part I'm trying to bring up is that we have so much to try and gain rough consensus around on, I guess I'll be presenting some of it here in the next 3 minutes or 5 minutes if Vishesh doesn't come back.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how we're going to go from A to B and where we're going to be in, say, 6, 8, 10 months, doesn't matter the number. And we have so much consensus to get through between now and then. You know, right now we're seeing the price degrade a little bit, and we just raised the stability fee. So maybe there's a wisdom in saying we need to have another week between the two. So in my mind's eye, you know, raising the debt ceiling doesn't really present a material risk unless we change the debt ceiling to some huge number, which we've discussed in the forums. But for me personally, I'd love to see at least the poll this week, even if it's not an executive vote, but a poll to try to increase that number, because we've got so many items that we have to get rough consensus on related to MCD. The debt ceiling is just some brain damage we have in the middle that it's a distraction that we need to put on the side and put it to bed.
Sure. It's technical debt, and so technical debt, well, you could talk for hours about the philosophies around technical debt, but it needs to be addressed. The question that I'm posing, though, is, does it need to be addressed in the next 3 weeks? Because sure, cleaning up the number of decisions that we need to make, it would be useful. But is that utility more than the expense of losing flexibility on the stability fee? Because there's obviously interest in what's happening with the stability fee right now. We've just moved to 18, and I just took the opportunity because I forgot to look at the poll before we started this call, and the community is signaling for 20.5 now. So obviously there's interest in the stability fee. It's hard to predict what the future is going to hold, like next week or the week after, right? So I guess this is my question. Oh, I have 2 questions because I don't know the answer, so they're not rhetorical. Do we need to do this now? Is the question, and here's from my neophyte financial analysis. I thought that we have a debt ceiling because of liquidity risk, right? Like, Cyrus, correct me if I'm wrong. Like, isn't the idea here that we have 100 million because somebody did math somewhere that said that over a 24-hour period in this market, we can comfortably liquidate X amount through the mechanisms, right?
I mean, that's the way you're supposed to do it. I think as part of kind of the alpha of SCD, they were just somewhat arbitrarily chosen.
Yeah.
So it's not like moving it in upwards would pose a significant liquidity risk beyond what risk we're already taking right now.
Yeah, I guess, and that's the question in my mind, is that you're right, it is arbitrary, and that was kind of a leading question because I knew it was arbitrary. But how much more arbitrary? Like, how do you measure arbitrary at this point? Because so we don't know for sure whether 100 million was good or not. So do we know for sure whether 150 is going to be as good, or is that horrible?
I mean, we will know as soon as the models are fully finished and we can run them. But in any case, I don't think just from a pragmatic standpoint, I don't think it should be raised 50 million at a time in this environment on the precipice of, just 10 or 20 million, I think is probably makes more sense to me.
Yeah, and forgive not anything, a negative tone on the criticism, but without knowing when MCD is actually going to launch, quote unquote, soon, right? Each time we go through a poll and then an executive vote, there's a 2-week cycle between those 2 points. And knowing the quantity of things we have to vote on, and the community not knowing when soon is, I'm trying to take the more conservative approach of let's get rid of the headache, get rid of the brain damage earlier than later, or at least push it off for enough time to allow us to get through the rest of the consensus that we need to be able to launch.
Yeah, I'm completely on board with that. And let me clarify a couple of things. So when we say the soon thing is coy and it's cute and all the rest of it, but one of the primary reasons we say soon is because we don't know exactly, and so that's even more unsatisfying. But here's why we don't know: because Cyrus and I and a bunch of other people have been spending. You'd be shocked to learn how much time we've been spending in meetings over the last 2 weeks trying to figure out how we can optimize and speed up the process to get us to MTD launch. And the reason, so as we pull apart these processes and the way that the system could potentially work and how we can optimize it and front load complexity here and then increase agility there, the takeaway over and over and over again is that when MCD launches has nothing to do with, well, I shouldn't say nothing. It's not up to MakerDAO. It's up to the community, and it's up to governance, and it's up to the risk teams. It's what's decided in these calls and in the forums and in the governance portal is what determines when MCD launches. We have a significant amount of work that needs to be completed, and I've touched on this in the blog posts that have gone out recently, but we need to get the general model in. We need to evaluate these asset classes. We need to figure out we need to find out how much debate is going to be kicked off by these things. We need to figure out the community's, the governance, maker token voters' appetite for risks or their appetite for complexity in the system. Because we could find that, we get into this cycle where we're talking about these asset classes and people are just waiting for us to stop talking so they can just say yes. Or we could find out that, the model goes out or the quantitative analysis go out and then thousands of shills show up in the forums and we need to sort through all of it. And that might take far longer than anybody expects. So we don't know how long it's going to take to iterate through these things. So that was sort of my speech about the soon thing, and I probably lost the thread here a bit, but I guess my question still remains. So let's assume that in 3 weeks we have a new governance portal, and that governance portal allows us to put up 1, 2, or 1,000 polls at once. Do we need to delay the stability fee vote between now and then in order to handle the debt ceiling poll?
Yeah, I would say it could wait 3 weeks. From my sense of things, it could wait 3 weeks. We're not that close to the limit right now. If it was at 99 million, I would say it would be urgent. Yeah,
and yeah, well, I understand. I'm not trying to create leading questions because I literally don't know. And so there's obviously risks here that, who knows, maybe a couple of whales just show up, or maybe the market turns on us and maybe, we rapidly approach that in the next couple of weeks. It's impossible to guess, but there's those concerns. And the other concern too is it loops back to my initial thing that I said at the top of the hour, where we have these emergent processes and we need to achieve consensus. We need to surface signals. We need to have debates, and we're just now taking the first baby steps about what that process actually looks like. And this forum post that I put in the link there is a great first step, but maybe I'm being overcautious, but I'm still unclear about at what point do we decide, okay, something has happened here. This is where it gets hard, right? Like we have the poll, we have, well, here's an example. I'm not calling out T-Bone because T-Bone's one of my favorite people, but the framing of this poll says based on various amounts of suggestions in our chat and forum. I look at that and I go, well, what suggestions and which subreddits, and what were those suggestions, and were they good or not, or were they logical or not? So in my mind, this is just a popularity poll. It's not exactly scientific governance. What I would love to see would be somebody coming into the forum saying that, like, hey, we had the situation with the debt ceiling because of X, Y, and Z. Look at this graph. here's my arguments for, and then somebody can say, here's my arguments against. And then after people digest this stuff, they go, okay, I'm going to vote for this number. That would be the ideal situation. But we haven't seen that in this thread, and I'm sure that's coming very soon. But there's that question, like how considered are these options? Do they need to be considered? Like, is there like a certain bar that needs to be met? And at what point? Oh yeah, sorry. I was going to say we don't know when it closes, but I stand corrected. It just says that it closed 5 hours ago. So I guess we do have time limits on these things. So I guess let me wrap this up. So when is Vishesh coming back? Oh my God. So let me wrap this up. We need to figure out what this process looks like, and I'm not going to tell people what this process looks like. So we need to figure it out in the forum. So there's another thread that's like, how do we achieve signal, and how do we determine that the signal is started and the signal is ended, and that we're all comfortable with the quality of that signal. And once we figure that out, that's going to be the pipeline where, and it's actually in another forum thread where it talks about, okay, we have loose chats here, there, Reddit, Twitter, whatever. It goes into a forum thread, it goes into discussion. At some point, that discussion ends or a poll ends. We review it in a governance call saying like, well, this is actually, we're doing it right now, so works out well. In a governance call, we say, hey, look at this signal request. We have a little chit chat, and then at some point that just turns into a poll. The turning into a poll thing is a significant event right now because we can only have one poll at a time. In 3 weeks, it will not be a significant event because we could have arbitrary numbers of polls. All right, I feel like, sorry, Matthew, I feel like for like the second or third time in response to one of your questions, I just began drifting aimlessly. I think I might be burned out. Did that answer your question?
So Vishesh did just return.
Yeah, I saw that. We're about to...
I'm sorry, there's a storm going, so I totally lost all Wi-Fi. I'm almost afraid to ask how far did I get in before I was cut off?
I think
you mean were you talking for a while and not realizing? Like, could you have been talking for like 10 minutes?
A few minutes.
The last thing I remember was that you were talking about the ETH price dropping with DAI towards the end of June.
Yeah,
that's like the last thing I remember.
Yeah, you said our model doesn't have that drop off yet, and then you dropped off.
Yeah. Well, if you're interested, I'm happy to finish running through. Otherwise, I know that ate up time. I'll just go now.
Yeah, we need to know what would Vishesh do. So let's go through it.
Okay, I'll power through really quick. My apologies for the technical. Ironically, the last thing that I had actually said in person was that was a lot in a little time. So hopefully I went through it quick enough. But okay, so yeah, so roughly I was just mentioning supply had run up, fairly significantly in that time period. There was some mention of big chunky 1 million DAI transactions in the last couple of days, but in the grand scheme of things, that's really not very huge. I mean, really at the end of June, we saw 4.3 million DAI minted in one day, so that significantly puts things in perspective. We saw that supply kind of increasing despite the increase in the stability fee, although there was a slight dip after the 17.5% increase, which does make sense. When you increase the stability fee, you do tend to see a little bit more of a refinancing over to secondary lending platforms. But even through the 18.5% increase, overall, the supply did continue to increase. It has kind of leveled out around that 91.3 million level. So some of this is also explained potentially by what's been going on with secondary lending platforms. But overall, it has been increasing. Debt circulation. So basically, the age of open debt has consistently decreased. The age of closed debt is kind of held pretty steady. So essentially this is due to new debt being created, and not much more old debt is being paid back, although there was a slight decrease through the most recent stability fee increases. More DAI is being drawn from new CDPs than old over the course of the month, which kind of does make sense with a lot of new DAI being minted, and some of this may be due to the fact that the same potential owners at the end of the day have opened new CDPs because they previously closed old ones. So what we saw, to basically echo what Cyrus was saying with the collateralization ratio, is over the month of June, that collateralization ratio ran up with the ETH price and then back down, although far more dramatically than the ETH price actually moved, if you look at like nominal percentage terms. So this kind of echoes that idea that as the ETH price decreases, collateralization in the short term decreases, but then people do tend to increase their collateral to quote unquote top up. And then as the ETH price, peaked around that June timeframe, June 25th timeframe, collateralization did run up as well, but then ran down more dramatically than the ETH price did in that same time period. So again, as the collateralization shoots up due to ETH price in the short term, people do tend to pull collateral out commensurately. And so you saw sort of this increase in leverage right at the end of June, beginning of July, which corresponded with some of the quote unquote damage to the DAI price. So I had already gone through the spread, but essentially that same volume weighted average has kind of held steady, even though there's been a more dramatic drop in the ETH price in that same time frame. So kind of that cutoff of ETH dropping from 280s to 270s. But during that same time frame, the DAI price is kind of held around that 0.98 level, which, sorry, DAI.cipher takes time to load. In the meantime, the secondary lending rates, so there was some new stuff on here. So the the weighted average borrow and supply rates, the weighted average borrow rate tends to hold just below that stability fee, even though DYDX tends to hold a bit of a premium over compound. On that average level, it does just hover below that line. So what's interesting is over the month of June, May was kind of an explosion for these secondary lending platforms. June has kind of been a steady increase in borrow volume and supply volume as well. Hard to see from these graphs, but the supply volume has kind of outpaced the borrow volume a little bit more. So that you see in this excess supply graph. So this is the amount of supply that is not being borrowed on these secondary lending platforms. And so this does tend to pretty closely correspond with those rates, because a lot of these platforms actually just algorithmically set their rates based on what this quote unquote cash float is. So that rate has, excess supply kind of been increasing through the month of June and into early July, with a bit of a dip around that same June 25th time period where the ETH price had kind of peaked. So this is interesting because you see the excess supply has increased recently, even though the overall DAI supply has increased and the stability fee has increased. Although a little bit of dip now recently, as people heard that 18.5% was coming around the bend. So the excess has decreased as DAI got more expensive, which made sense. But initially, it was running up with that DAI supply. So that was interesting. Potentially, people purchasing DAI from others who were selling it for leverage, and then relending it on secondary lending platforms just to get a little bit extra interest. So this last graph just basically mimics this one around the utilization rates. So I had kind of looked at this initially to see if there was a relationship between the stability fee and the utilization rates on the secondary lending platforms, to basically circle back to an old conversation that we had with Rich around to what extent can you use secondary lending platforms to learn what to do with the stability fee or other monetary policy things on Maker. But I think we tend to see what's roughly expected, which there is a relationship when the stability fee is decreased or increased to what happens to these utilization rates. But during the time period when the stability fee is flat, you also do see some pretty solid fluctuation in these rates. So what I'm basically saying is when the stability fee is being changed or other significant monetary policy components are being changed on Maker, you need to wait, I think, for some of these metrics to settle on the secondary lending platforms. But whilst, all is quiet on the Western Front, then you do tend to see some potentially leading indicators that you can listen to around what's going on in terms of basically oversupply. And so it's been a complex, I think, point to touch on. Some people talking about to what extent is this supply people who've leveraged out of DAI and sold it, and other people who are just purchasing it and lending, versus people who are actually drawing DAI out and then holding on to it, and in the meantime, actually lending it out on these secondary lending platforms. One of the data points that I think will be helpful to illuminate that, which, sorry, I was looking for a tab that I had recently closed. Okay. I'll circle back to it in a second, but I'll just verbally describe. So the transaction volume on DAI has actually been pretty huge lately. So over the course of the last month or so, the transaction volume has been, actually since May, really, the transaction volume has been significantly higher than it had been pretty much through the end of 2018 and the beginning of 2019, with the exception of around that, and November, December time period for 2018. But that was kind of an atypical point for everything in Maker. So since then, you've kind of seen a pretty significant increase in that transaction volume, which is, I think, a positive indicator for people who are, and it's significantly outpaced the increase in trading volume during that time. So it's not just attributable to trading volume. So I think that's a pretty positive indicator for people who are wanting to look at, to what extent is DAI being used and transacted on outside of just being traded for leverage, because it does appear to have been picked up fairly significantly. So the other last point that I want to touch on, and sorry for taking up extra time here, but the liquidations. So, some people have talked about, there was, a significant amount of liquidations recently. Just want to put that in perspective. So the liquidations recently have been, yes, present, but overall in the grand scheme of things, not huge, and have actually been at fairly high collateralization ratios. So this can potentially be attributable to less volatility in the ETH price, although I think we know that's not true. The ETH price has, dropped significantly recently, but I think also attributable to the fact that there was a higher overall collateralization ratio recently than there had been in the past. And I think, potential more efficiency in how these liquidations are being carried out. So you do see a bit of an...
Do you have any long-term, is that all of the history there for all of the liquidations? Do we know what the lowest, have we ever had anything go lower than 1.4, whatever that number is, 4.3?
So the one caveat I will say is there are sometimes transactions, and this is what makes liquidations hard, in the same block. And there are sometimes changes to the collateralization ratio and liquidations in the same block, in the same transaction hash. And so ordering those events properly is sometimes a little bit tricky, and ordering them also with in the same block price tick, because there tends to be liquidation in the block that there is a price tick. So getting that level of precision and being 100% confident is hard. But that being said, I think there are some rounding errors where once in a blue moon, you'll see a collateralization ratio around 154, which is, not possible. But pretty much every data set, there's this one liquidation I've kept my eyes on. It happened early on, and it happened at 154% collateralization. But pretty much every data set I've seen around Maker shows that same blip. So, but it's very tiny. And so that's my point, is I will say there are sometimes outliers in the data sets, either slightly above the line or fairly low. But I think those are very small CDPs where kind of that rounding error can make things seem a little bit more extreme than it is. So accepting those cases, by and large, yeah, I think the collateralizations have all been in this range roughly. So the takeaway is overall collateralizations have been pretty safe, and they've gotten safer recently. And I think this is primarily due to the fact that collateralization overall, so if I flip back over this, has collateralization overall has come up hugely from, you know, a year ago, 6 months ago. But also I think a little bit of improvement in efficiency of how the keepers are operating and how quickly they're getting to those liquidations. But the latter is really, really difficult to show on the data. Okay, sorry, I took extra time, but hopefully that was worth it for the people that stayed.
All right, we're at an hour and a half, but I don't have a hard stop, so I'm fine with sticking around. Cyrus, can you stick around too for a bit?
For a little bit, yeah.
All right, if there's questions for Vishesh, we can address those. Or Matthew, do you still want to dig into the narrative? Did we lose you?
And I have been talking on mute. It's the process of going through, rather than after an hour and a half, it's probably best if we just put a link in the chat group for going to discuss the points from the forum. But it's going through the consensus and the logical sequence about how we can float, basically die when we reinvent it or relaunch it. It's, you know, absolutely not a statement that we have to do it that way, but just let's beat the crap out of it and make it better.
Okay, Vishesh, do you see any questions in the chat that you wanted to address? I've been following them.
I just answered one real quick, and then one point that was touched on earlier, I think, is the debt ceiling. I think I just want to make sure that that conversation is moving forward, because as the supply...
We talked about it while you were cut out.
Okay, cool. So I'll just leave it at that. And then, yeah, I answered 18.5. Again, I would have waited from the 17.5% increase to see what would happen before even doing the 18.5% increase. So that happened rather quickly, in my opinion. A further potential increase, I think, is a little bit premature. So I am generally going to recommend more wait and see and collection of data kind of mentality before making potentially rash decisions, because I think some of the effects of these changes do take time to realize.
All right, I think that, well, maybe we're running out of steam a bit. It was a great call, though. We got through a lot. So thank you, Vishesh. Thank you, Matthew, for your input and your gracious willingness to move things to the forum after this long call. Cyrus, and thank you to me for my deep wisdom and insights. All right, this post will go up. I'm moving the conversation away from Reddit and into the forum. So the Reddit summaries for these agendas have been locked, and I'm directing people to the forum. So if you're interested in looking at the summary, keep an eye on the forums. David will get something up there for you soon, and I'll be posting links to the socials in Twitter. All right, thanks everybody.